Okay, let's get started. So, what did you guys think of existentialism as a humanism? 2 thumbs down.
I enjoyed reading it.
But you didn't enjoy it.
I didn't enjoy it.
Yeah. Okay. Anybody else? 2 thumbs down across the board.
I enjoyed its question. Like its appeal to living and not like the depressing and then figuring out how to be okay with like depressed almost.
Okay.
Instead, it felt like hey, not everything has to suck.
Yeah, it has a voice of resilience, right? It's not pessimism or optimism, but like resilience, tenacity or something. Yeah. What else? What were other impressions? Yeah, sure.
I think I liked existentialism up until this point, which is to say I don't think of existentialism person. That didn't resonate with me. It's really funny. I thought of you when I was reading this. I was like, oh, we hate that. I can't remember your name. I'm sorry, but
Jason?
I knew you'd be on the 2 thumbs down.
Interesting.
Yeah. I was like, oh, he hates it. Having to do with free will.
Right. Yep. Right on. Right.
Yeah, the determinism point. I also thought, Jason, when I read that determinism,
Wait,
like,
what did you
uh-oh.
say about that before? I missed it.
Me?
Yeah.
I'm just not a free will fan.
Same.
Big
Yeah.
determinist.
I found that to be an interesting part of this book.
Yeah.
I noticed that he was very against determinism, right?
Well, so my impression, and this is my take, is that Sartre's view of determinism is similar to Sartre's view of God. That even if there is such a thing, then it doesn't really matter, right? That if God speaks, it's too silently for us to hear. If natural law determines our fate all the way through, then, well, damn it, we still feel like we're free and it kind of sucks. So how do we work through it? But I mean, he does just say we just don't accept determinism. And that could be also a metaphysical thesis. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, I have a penchant is maybe a nice way of putting it, almost ironic for what I'm about to say, of charitably interpreting. It's what I've been trained to do over and over. And so it might just be that I'm being too charitable to Sartre here. But other impressions from existentialism as a humanism. We didn't like the super emphasis on free will, it sounds like. Yeah.
My hot take that I'm not fully committed to, but I might be, is that I feel like it might meet Camus' definition of philosophical suicide.
Interesting. Why is that?
Because Camus is very committed to remaining true to the absurd and not, trying to find a way to ignore it. And it feels like Sartre talks about the universal human condition, I think is the word he uses. And then there's a lot of these ideas of humanity having some universal experience.
Subjectivity.
And that seems to me like denying the absurd. I don't know if it necessarily is, but that's what it seemed like when I was reading it.
Good. So this is actually a really interesting point to bring up, and draws contrasts between Sartre and Camus. And in fact, a difference between the two that ended up being a wedge in their personal relationship as well. So what Sartre is doing, and again, I've curated the readings for this class to sort of tell a story. And the movement of this final part of the story of the class is the development of these existentialist ideas from internal, personal, problematic to how do we live together? How do we socialize with the absurd and the problem of being? And that is Sartre's move, and it's developed and perfected through de Beauvoir. So what Sartre does is, you're completely right, something that Camus would disagree with, is he says, look, we all share this universal human subjectivity, this fact of our existence is equivalent in all of us, and there's important metaphysical features of how we ought to interrelate that arise from concluding that we all share in this universal condition, such as the fact that we're all radically free. We recognize ourselves through the recognition of radical freedom in others, and that we ought to will the freedom of others for the sake of like staying true to that rational conclusion. Camus would not go that far at all. The subjection of humankind to a universal subjectivity is a leap in reason that he would be unhappy with. So where Camus' system works really well for Camus, and if you like feel that vibe and that energy like from Camus, like you're convinced by his project, it might work really well for you too, but how does it communicate with others? How does it extrapolate itself? How does it expand itself to a social setting? And at least from the perspective of Camus' first cycle, it doesn't. And this is what it happens with Sartre's existentialism and humanism. How do we like apply the principles that we've derived through our anguished and despaired considerations of the human intersubjective condition, which is universal? And how do we make like a political statement, political party platform? How do we move forward together through it? So yeah, good observation. What else? Anybody online? Did you guys have thoughts about the book that we read for today? Thoughts? No thoughts? Did you like it? You certainly must have had feelings. Did nobody have any feelings?
I had feelings. I think, well, first of all, I think that he was excellent at discussing his points and making the read something that made sense when a lot of the other people we've read were a little flowery in their language and got to the point, you know, they needed some brevity. I think that he's a great writer and a great teacher. That's one thing I think about this. I don't know that I completely agree with, you know, his, as I was reading it, his example of the young man, you know, who, or no, it was the man that he met that became a Jesuit. And I don't necessarily agree that that was his choice was completely his own. I mean, he had definitely had been, I mean, that's one thing I don't know that I completely agree with the fact that our choices are completely our own. I think that things happen to us, and the things that happen to us that weren't our choice often affect so greatly the choices that we do make. So that's what I thought about the reading.
Good, thank you. So we'll talk about that example. I have some slides on it. We'll in fact have a group discussion about it. And yeah, the other point is the clarity of it. That's one of the big virtues of this reading, is how clear it all is. So Existentialism as a Humanism is a lecture that Sartre gave that develops a bunch of other views from his corpus, or at least explains them. So it might not always give the argument for what he is saying. In fact, it rarely does. He has some like nice arguments and examples here and there. But there's a whole lot of stuff that just sort of flies under the radar, as I've said this before, right? So like refer to previous work. And so what today's lecture will do is try to pick out all of those different features that are important to Sartre as a thinker and as an existentialist, as well as to talk through his arguments. And yeah, even in spite of the fact that he doesn't clarify himself on like important features of the existentialist system, assuming that like people would already know it, it reads really clearly. Like you just like get through it, and it's enjoyable in its clarity, I think. So word of warning, this won't be your experience for the next 2 weeks. The ethics of ambiguity is really hard It's really hard. It is an incredibly challenging read. It is the most challenging thing that I assign for the whole semester, but it's at the end because you kind of have to have read all of the rest of what we've read to even have a chance. And it's really good. So for all of its challenging qualities, it is just like a really nice development of what Camus hoped to do by not turning away from the absurd, and what Sartre hopes to do in like collectivizing the like pragmatic utility and power of existentialism, like bring people together to like will freedom and make the world a better place. And she like takes jabs at both, but it is really hard. So this week's breath of fresh air hopefully has us energized to dig into that very challenging reading coming up. So, okay, with that being said, let's get back to this week's Existentialism is a Humanism. So Sartre, he was tied for top philosopher in France with Simone de Beauvoir. So there's this thing called the agrégation test. It's like a civil service exam, basically. For teachers, you take a bunch of classes, and then it's something like a dissertation, kind of. He got the highest score, and Simone de Beauvoir tied with him. And I think I heard this. I didn't actually verify it, but Simone Weil took classes with them as well. So for like our reading group, and Simone de Beauvoir said of Weil that if anyone in the class was going to be smarter than her, she was glad it was Weil. And so there you go. So maybe they would have done a bit better than both of them, but sort of like stuns the world getting nearly perfect scores on the aggregation. He had a lifelong polyamorous relationship with Simone de Beauvoir. Super interesting social stuff going on there. Maybe completely inappropriate for our contemporary moral ideas. So de Beauvoir and Sartre were in love lifelong and were like partners their whole life in philosophy, in political activism, in social life. And there are all these interesting stories about them like seducing each other's students to sleep with the other, and strange risque stories of salons and polyamorous philosophical orgies and stuff. So yeah, if you're into the interesting flavor of life, slice of life quality of what it's like to be a public philosopher in France in the 1950s, then look no further than the lives of Simone de Beauvoir and Jean-Paul Sartre. He was also a lifelong Marxist, to his detriment and probably insanity towards the end of his life. He traveled to Soviet Russia as an adult. He met Fidel and Che Guevara. There are like pictures of this sit down, and he ended his life as a Maoist. So he was just like completely committed to the Marxist agenda, and sort of in spite of all of the problems, so to speak, that Mao perpetrated, right? But still, like the ideas were the drawing features for Sartre. So his Marxist leanings were so powerfully represented in his political life that they even alienated him from the Communist Party of his day, which is where we get existentialism as a humanism. This is like a response to the communists, right? He was a public intellectual, so he's like the way more badass Neil deGrasse Tyson of the 1940s and 50s. And he and his crew were celebrities. Everybody knew Jean-Paul Sartre, everybody knew Simone de Beauvoir, everybody knew Camus. These were like household names, institutions of the day and of modern Europe. And he's the father of proper existentialism. So there might have been a period where casually Camus called himself an existentialist, like in casual conversation, but like never avowed the name for himself. And Simone de Beauvoir calls herself an existentialist only for a very short period, and then says, nah, I don't like the title. But Sartre came up with the name, invented it, and holds on to it his whole life long. He was a war prisoner, a freedom fighter, a man of the people. Though he was from a bourgeois background, he came from a rich family, grew up in Paris, had access to all the best education, all the best resources, all this. He advocates for the proletariat and their rights and their ability to avoid tyranny all of his life. During the war, he was captured or arrested by the Germans and brought to a prisoner of war camp. I don't know if he was treated poorly. I can't recall, but he was in a war camp there. And he publishes Existentialism as a Humanism in 1946, directly following the Second World War. Here's a bunch of really fun photos. So like Sartre being a public intellectual, like there's all this like really cool historical record of the wild, amazing life that he lived. So like in the upper, I suppose if you're facing it left, that's him and Jean-Luc Godard, the super famous film director who invents French New Wave, basically invents it. And there's a bunch of pictures in the middle there, him and Simone de Beauvoir handing out flyers and protesting. And right there's Michel Foucault. So the three of them are like the homies, and like they're marching in protest. And then the bottom left there, I love this picture. There's de Beauvoir and Sartre, and Camus in it, but he's petting the dog, which is like a total Camus move. Just ignoring the picture and the people around him just to love the dog. And then there's good old Che Guevara and Simone Sartre. So yeah, just like cool. What a cool life and a cool period to have been alive. And Jean-Luc Godard is inspired. His movies come from Jean-Paul Sartre. The Ingmar Bergman, The Seventh Seal, comes from Sartre, right? That this guy writes so much and becomes so powerfully popular as like an intellectual that he inspires an entire generation of art and a form of philosophical thinking that like continues on to this day, as we discussed a bit last week. Okay, so the content of existentialism is humanism. The lecture is geared to respond to two objections that have been levied against the existentialists. One is that existentialism leads to quietism and despair. This is the communists who are objecting in this way. So if you are a political party of the day, you do not want some set of beliefs to lead people into despair and quietude. You want people to like revolt and say, yeah, I'm taking my power and my enfranchised will into my own hands, and I'm gonna like realize the political world that I want to see for myself. If we're just, you know, sitting in a dark room with a blanket over our head listening to James Blunt songs, that does not make political change, right? That we need something a little bit more motivating. And so the communists are accusing the existentialists of not being motivating in the right sort of way. So as Sartre says, one group after another censors us for overlooking humanity's solidarity and for considering man as an isolated being. This is because we base our doctrine on pure subjectivity. That is, on the Cartesian, I think, on the very moment in which man fully comprehends his isolation, rendering us incapable of reestablishing solidarity with those who exist outside of the self and are inaccessible through the cogito. That the cogito is something solipsistic, is what he's saying here. And that if existentialism depends upon this analogous sort of, I think I recognize myself moment, then its brand of solipsism doesn't create the right kind of care for others that a political movement needs. And so what Sartre is going to do to address this concern, to allay the worry, is to explain how existentialism is connected to this like subjective experience, but invents this word intersubjectivity, right? Which is a hugely important word for gender studies, for instance, today, and critical theory in English departments. So this intersubjectivity is supposed to be the basis upon which the cogito analog that the existentialists use doesn't lead you into solipsism, but into the social world. And the other objection is that existentialism leads to a kind of inhumanism. And this comes from like the everyday person, your like religious, go to church or sort of people, the normal people. So it is public knowledge that the fundamental reproach brought against us is that we stress the dark side of human life. Recently, someone told me about a lady who, after uttering an inadvertent vulgar expression, excuses herself by saying, "I think I'm becoming an existentialist." So, like I was saying last week, existentialists were accused of being Debbie Downers, and like it was, if you were a little sad, someone might call you an existentialist, like this woman here. So the purpose of this public lecture was to vindicate the philosophical school from these very practical objections. And Sartre wanted his philosophical school to help people live better lives, primarily to be like the intellectual meat and bones that inspired a political movement that was all about the expression of people's freedom for the sake of using their will in a creative and self-endeavoring way that avoided tyranny and that emphasized authenticity and good faith, all of which we'll talk about as it comes up. Good. So what is existentialism? Well, it's something like what gets inspired when we think about paper knives. It's an idea strictly intended for specialists and philosophers. I thought, as I read it for class yesterday, when I read this line, I thought, well, for someone who's trying to like convince a society that existentialism is actually cool and like we should not discount it, to say this, like you might just alienate everybody right off the bat, right? That, look, you're too stupid to be an existentialist, so please don't be too stupid to object to me, right? It just seems like super inflammatory and not the right strategy. That the whole content, the inspiration for giving a lecture at all is to like get people on board. And then he's saying, well, look, it's only really for us philosophers, you paupers, so better look next time, right? It seems a little gatekeepy, but which is also like contradictory to the point. I don't know, I found this kind of striking. So maybe in the spirit of being overly and even to like a fault charitable, we just ignore this line. Okay, so there were, says Sartre, Christian existentialists and atheistic or agnostic, in the sense that like, look, whether or not God exists, it doesn't matter. This was kind of the common line of Camus and Sartre and the existentialists of the day. There are all sorts of existentialists, all of which share this common idea that existence precedes essence, that the existence of God has no bearing on what inspires the existentialist school. Thought we've talked about this, I've mentioned this line quite a bit, existence precedes essence. Well, here's our like full and true exemplification of that. So if we consider a manufactured object, such as a paper knife, we note that this object was produced by a craftsman who drew his inspiration from a concept. He referred both to the concept of what a paper knife is and to a known production technique that is a part of that concept and is by and large a formula. The paper knife is thus both an object produced in a certain way and one that, on the other hand, serves a definite purpose. Now, what is he going to say about humans? Yeah.
We don't have that like set purpose when we were created.
Yeah, exactly. We are not created by some artisan with a concept in mind that if there is some essence to what it is to be a human, we are in the process of creating it insofar as we are being at all, right? That it doesn't precede us, or if it does precede us, it only does so as a social construct. But what's like really true in us, we are like making it up as we go. So the paper knife's essence precedes its existence. This is in contrast with the human, right? That there is this idea of what it is to be a paper knife. And so you create an object that serves the function as a tool with some like end for the sake of which the tool might be used in mind, opening letters, right? Cutting through paper. And the object in that very specific form, its paper knife form, doesn't come about without that concept. The concept precedes the existence of the object. But is a human like a paper knife? Well, no, as Will just told us. And our everyday theistic thinkers, at least from the Abrahamic religious tradition, think so. Man is created in the image of God, right? And if even not in the image of specifically, then like we're not all born with big white beards doing this with our finger, right? Then at least humankind's creation is preceded by some divine intellect. This divine intellect is a really common, kind of interesting idea that comes to us from the Enlightenment period. So the Enlightenment thinkers distinguish between the divine will and the divine intellect in order to explain how God can be free, even though God is like triumphantly perfect, necessary, like God must necessarily do the best thing, and God knows all the best things available, and God can do any of the best things. So what these Enlightenment thinkers do is they say, well, yeah, sure, the divine intellect necessarily knows all the best things to do, but the divine will is separate from that. And in being separate from it can just make its own choice. And it turns out the divine will always chooses what's best. And anyways, the divine intellect is just the idea that even if like humankind is not created in the image of God, that at least like God has some perfect, complete conception, omniscience of like the totality of the cosmos, and then creates it. So essence leading to existence. Yeah, Will?
Do you think you can make something without essence? Like if I just like drew a line on my paper?
That would be sort of like what it is to be a human. Yeah.
I mean, like, do you think you can make something?
So you can mold clay in any which way, right? And then set it down and realize that, hey, this is useful as like a doorstop, right? So the existence of the clay, the way that it's been molded together, has been formed in a particular way, but not for a particular reason, not to be a doorstop, right? And it's only sort of like after the fact that you notice like the pragmatic function that that object can use, and so you use it as such, right? So the meaning is in this like existence precedes essence way for like the sort of creation of chaos, I suppose is what you might call it, if I'm getting your intuition right here, would just say that the meaning is something derivative of the way that the clay has been formed. And the alternative would be to say, I want to make a doorstop and I know what that should look like. So I like specifically form the clay into a wedge or something like that. Does that answer your question?
Kind of, but yeah.
Do you want to try again?
No, maybe after.
Okay, sure. So with respect to like essence preceding existence, the theistic man created in the image of God thing, human nature and universality are also postulated by atheists and humanists, non-theists, to be essences through which the human existence is justified, dignified, evaluated, that it lives for the sake of, right? So like we all have this universal equality, or there's like something in us that is worthy and it's in everybody. This is why we have natural rights, this sort of thing, right? So you don't need to be a theist to think in this sort of way that essence precedes existence, and there's like a right way for people to be, right? And this is just what the existentialist denies. They deny that essence precedes existence, at least for humans. For paper knives, not so much. But for humans, we are in the process of the meaning-making activity for our being in the act of being. To be is to exist. And if God does not exist, there's at least one being in whom existence precedes essence, because there was no idea of what that person should be. And whatever ideas they come up with and say like, hey, you should be that too, it's all social construct, right? A being whose existence comes before its essence, a being who exists before he can be defined by any concept of it. That being is man, or as Heidegger put it, the human reality. So in existence, we perceive, and in perceiving, we encounter ourselves. And this moment of encountering is an odd one and distinctly human, says Sartre. We experience ourselves as existing and being, and we encounter ourselves, when we encounter ourselves, we also experience ourselves as a separate intellectual entity that reflectively looks down upon that existing being as such. So this encountering activity, how does it work? Well, you just are, you're in the world being, right? And then you kind of reflectively realize, oh, hey, there I just was being, but also here I am thinking about how I just was being. And so these two like states, right? There's this sort of contemplative, reflective state, and the one that just is in the world. But that contemplative, reflective state doesn't happen before the being in the world one does. We are in the world and then we encounter ourselves. So says Sartre. This is the relationship. And it's from that contemplative, reflective place that we do the meaning-making activity. We give meaning or essence to the like thing that was in the world before. So we are at once the artisan, the artist, as well as the work, the art, right? We are the thing that abstracts and says, here's what I shall be, here's what I will become, right? We exercise our will and our power of judgment to become what we self-reflectively contemplate as what we ought to do or be like. Yeah, Ashley.
So it's kind of like, instead of thinking of ourselves as made up of materials, it's kind of like we are a material and we can become whatever tool we want, like we're the clay and we can
Yeah, I think you're right, the metaphor works here. That from the reflective contemplative attitude, there are going to be some, like, similar to Camus has his three consequences, so does Sartre. They're different, but similar. And one of those three consequences is freedom, right? And what he calls radical freedom, which is similar to the Karamazov phrase, like everything is permissible, right? So in the same way that any way that you could shape clay is like possible, it's like held within the potential of that mass of wet dirt. Similar for us, but with respect to like meaning making. And it's going to turn out that if we can determine for ourselves how best to be, and everything is permissible, like we have all of the freedom that everything is permissible, we have like radical freedom, then whatever we create, we're responsible for creating. And there are right and wrong ways to exercise that freedom. So like in good faith or in bad faith, meaning that if I say I'm going to make a doorstop and then I create a David, then that would be a creation in bad faith. I can have done it, but my principle and what I created have come apart. And so there's this like sense of good faith being what makes authentic meaning making like truly valuable, and the kind of creation that we want to be responsible for. All of that will sort of get worked out through this. Does that answer your question? Cool.
Great British meaning show.
Yeah, the Great British Meaning Show. Yeah, hopefully with less soggy bottoms. So if man, as existentialists conceive of him, cannot be defined, it is because to begin with, he is nothing. He will not be anything until later, and then he will be that what he makes of himself. Thus, there is no human nature since there is no God to conceive of it. Man is not only that which he wills himself to be, and since he conceives of himself only after he exists, such as he wills himself to be after being thrown into existence, man is nothing other than what he makes of himself. This is the first principle of existentialism. And this is important. So existence precedes essence, sure, but what does that commit us to? Well, it commits us to the fact that whatever we end up being, we are the author of that. And Sartre has some stuff to say about fate that might be sort of controversial on this point. I think Ryan brought something up about like neurodivergence and fate on the discussion board, which I thought was an interesting question with respect to this and like how responsible we can be or should be considered for ourselves. But at least this is what Sartre says is the first principle, is that if there's nothing before we encounter ourselves of like what we are, what we should be, then when we do encounter ourselves, we become the author of that self. And that is the first principle. Okay. So radical freedom. I've already talked a little bit about freedom. If existence truly precedes essence, man is responsible for what he is. Thus, the first effect of existentialism is to make every man conscious of what he is and to make him solely responsible for his own existence. It's kind of like hardline old codgery responsibility, right? That whatever you are, you did it to yourself kind of vibe here. And when we say that man is responsible for himself, we do not mean that he is responsible only for his own individuality, but that he is responsible for all men. In choosing for himself, he chooses for all men. And this is sort of the meat of radical freedom, that insofar as we choose what to do and how to meaning make for our own being, for ourselves, if everybody is equally nothing until they encounter themselves, then insofar as we have realized for ourselves to be the author of some form of meaning, we are likewise legislating for all people that this is a way that you can be. We take the possibility of the clay that is our being and we realize it in a particular way and we say, hey, look, you can do this too because you're just like me, right? You can meaning make in this way as well, which makes us radically responsible for the way in which we exercise our freedom to be that way, to meaning make another. Yeah, Shane.
At least when I read it, I think I read it a bit differently, which caused me problems. So I just want to like check. It wasn't like you can do this thing. When you do something, it doesn't allow other people to do the thing. It tells them they should do the thing. That's how I read it. And then if that is like maybe a way to read it, where does that jump occur? Like from can to should? Yeah,
good. So this is also, you're right, that there's more than just the descriptive thing, right? The possibility of becoming an actuality, saying like, look, you can do this too. It's like, you should do this. This is a strange normative perspective that is not argued for here. This is one of these things that he just kind of glosses over in explaining like what existentialism is. The normative like power is I've done it from nothing, and this is the best way that I could do it, and I'm advocating for it, right? And if it, as like a creator of my own way of doing it, I become the advocate of that way. And so insofar as I am that way out in the world with you, I'm saying like, look at me, you should do as I've done as well. Right? And so there's, which is, again, not argued for here, but an important feature of the like political side of the existentialist, like encountering and meaning making project. And that like, he's not just trying to like say, look, I need a way to not kill myself or like distract myself from the absurd, this Camus project. How do I like do that internally, figure out the machinations of mind to like live okay? But what Sartre wants us to do is like live well together, not have the world fall into a pit of despair and war and destruction again, ever. And so building in this like collective perspective to the encountering and meaning making project pressures social groups, and to be the right sort of existentialist person begets more of those right sort of existentialist people, begets your perfect existentialist society kind of thing. So at least that's what I take his motivation to be. How he makes that is that jump from like, look, I'm this way, you can be too, to I'm this way, you should be too. Might just be a feature of like pragmatic performance. Yeah. Well,
Can we dumb it down in my head? Because now I feel like I'm off. What like Sartre say like the radical freedom we have is almost contained in a way by this responsibility we carry. Like I shouldn't go out and kill people because then other people would go out and kill people.
Yeah.
And having that responsibility like contains this freedom we have?
Yeah, so, but not like metaphysically. You're still free to like murder people. But again, as I was saying to Ashley, which wasn't clear, but like will become clear as we talk more, sort of like make a second pass at it, is that there are better and worse ways to exercise our freedom. So if all is permissible, everything is like open to us through the clay, can be molded in any shape, right? There are better and worse shapes. There are pretty shapes and there are ugly shapes. And an ugly shape will be like killing people, right? A pretty shape will be living authentically in a way that wills the existence, continuity, and capacity for expression of other people's freedom just as well as your own.
I'm not really sure how to ask this, but like, has there been done like a really thorough examination of like morals and ethics? Because I'm asking this because I don't see how, like, I mean, not that it shouldn't be so, but I don't really see how existence precedes essence, therefore we shouldn't kill other people. Like, I don't see, because there's an implication of like an existing moral there that like I'm not really like seeing where he's arriving to that. So I'm just wondering, like, has nobody really ever done it because it's just common sense, or
Like why we shouldn't kill people.
yes?
He makes a Kantian move, which I think I have a slide on. So Kant, have you studied Kant before?
No, I mean, no.
Okay, so Kant is what's called like a deontologist, where you're able to determine what's good by way of reason. So you can like think through an issue, and he has what's called the categorical imperative, which has a few different expressions. So the first one is the principle of universality. Act always such that the maximum of your action can be universalized, meaning that if the maximum of your action, like to steal cars or to steal something, if everybody did that, then nobody would like own anything and the world would break down to say like lying. Kant says lying is always wrong, even when it like in an instance might make a good thing. Like for fun, I'm growing out my facial hair and I think it looks terrible. But like I said, if I asked you like, hey, how does it look? And you said, oh yeah, it looks great. And I would know you're lying. But it might make me feel good, right? So like the lie like does something good in the instance, but Kant says even that's wrong, right? Because it can't be universalized. If everybody lied, meaning would in language would just be gone. Nobody would be able to understand anybody because we wouldn't know if it was a lie or the truth. And the third formulation, let's skip the second, is act always such the maximum of your action would be consistent with the something of the kingdom of ends, like the quality of the kingdom of ends, which is basically like in the world, the perfect utopic world in which everybody acts in a way that respects other people's dignity and the maxims of their actions can be universalized. In that perfect utopia, your actions are also consistent with that. And Sartre invites us to think, well, what if everybody did this, right? Which is sort of a Kantian move. And the murder thing just doesn't satisfy that consideration. If everybody killed everybody, nobody dead, right? There's another like pass at the argument, which is not fully robust in existentialism as a humanism, but de Beauvoir really doubles down. And in the Ethics of Ambiguity, she's really excited about freedom and the protection of freedom. And that's present here, but really it's like her idea and probably her influence on Sartre for it. But to kill someone is to not respect their freedom. And I'll talk about this at the very end of the lecture, where the respect of other people's freedom is to respect your own freedom and to have this like break where you exercise your own freedom at the cost of someone else's, say like through murder or through taking advantage of them or whatever, is to act in bad faith, because it's to use your own like free will to limit another person's free will. So the exercise contradicts the principle through which the exercise is performed. And this would also disallow murder. Do you have a hand, Rachel?
Oh, no.
No.
Well, okay, I do have a question.
Okay.
This kind of seems like this sounds like early libertarianism and anarchism, like personal or like positive liberty and negative liberty. That came before existentialism. Did it?
I don't know the history of libertarianism, but probably. And yeah, those themes are like really strong in Sartre. I mean, Marxism is a kind of anarchism ultimately. Like the end of Marxist history is one in which everybody just gets along, and we don't need like fiat or force de jure. We don't need like rule of power for everybody to get along, because we all just kind of get that. Hey, I got to treat you good, you treat me good too, and it's all fine, right? So like those themes really strong here. Yeah. Well,
I don't want to derail us too much, but this is kind of on the topic. Is on page 47, Sartre starts talking like, why shouldn't someone choose bad faith? And like, what if I want to be in bad faith? And I feel like he just kind of like maybe it's just my read, but I feel like he kind of skimps out on the question. Like I feel like it's unanswered.
yeah.
If you've got a slide that like speaks on Sartre, or speaks for Sartre. we
Yeah.
can get
So
back to that later.
I have stuff on bad faith that we'll get to. I have a little bit of discussion about that at the very end. And then it's not going to be until de Beauvoir that we get like a full picture of like what's wrong with that way of thinking. Now, Sartre does talk about it a little bit when he talks about like the corporate leader taking advantage of their employees, but we'll cover all of that as we go through. So radical freedom. Let's get through it because we're starting to read ahead quite a bit. So we're entirely responsible for what we do, and we're not merely responsible for our own person, but insofar as we like say, look, I did this, we're saying you can and in fact should do this yourself to all of the human race. So we're radically responsible insofar as we're radically free. And so in an existence where humans make themselves through action, the only morality is that which we set forth through our own acts. Actions legislate universally. So by declaring this is what ought to be done insofar as I do it myself. And so, as I mentioned, Sartre has his sort of like three consequences of these of freedom and responsibility in their radical forms, which is anguish, abandonment, and despair. So anguish, and these are technical terms. These are important technical terms for Sartre. So anguish at the realization that we are radically free and universally responsible, life gets much weightier. Everything we do becomes really quite heavy, right? Oh no, I've just determined that this is the way that everybody should be just by doing it myself, right? Everything I choose to do must be able to universally affirm, which is like Nietzsche, right? Or otherwise to turn away in bad faith, which is kind of philosophical suicide. So what would happen if everybody did what I'm doing? This is a consideration Sartre says we ought to make. And this is the Kantian point, right? I don't think Sartre is making this Kantian point in the same way Kant makes it. So Kant wants us to do the hypothetical imperative, the categorical imperative, to determine by reason what our duty is, what's right and wrong. Here, I think Sartre is saying, in asking ourselves and considering reflectively, like what would happen if everybody did what I'm doing, is that consistent with what could end up being a moral law or a universal moral law? He's not so much worried about like determining that we have a duty to do so, because that's already sort of like inscribed into having completed the act itself, insofar as we're like radically free and responsible, but rather have we acted in good faith, which is not so much a here's what you ought to do, because that's legislated by the act itself, but rather was this legislation better or worse than other possible legislations? So what is good and bad faith? Well, I gave one example earlier, I suppose in the single expression, I would say something like bad faith has to do with the practical expression of an act, and it's inspiration. It's like principle for the act. So if your act and your expression, like your act and your principle for acting, or like your system of values come apart, then you're acting in bad faith. So Iago in Othello surrenders, and the enemy lets down their guard, and then he fires on them when their guard is let down. This is an action in bad faith, right? The surrendering is an action in bad faith. To act in good faith would be to like bravely fight down the enemy in spite of, you know, like them hating. And Sartre has this example of Pierre the waiter, right? So Pierre is like your twirl the mustachios, snarky French guy who walks up to the bourgeois table and says, "Oh, may I get you your wine, monsieur?" Right? And you know, like the bourgeois people say, "Oh yes, thank you so much." He says, "Oh, it is my pleasure." But like, you know, he walks away and thinks, "I hate these people. They're like the absolute worst. They like disgust me," right? And so your waiter is acting in bad faith because they pretend to like this person. They act, they legislate, "I ought to love and like this person," right? But their principle is, "I hate this person's guts." And so this is an action in bad faith. To act in good faith is to act authentically, right? Authenticity being an underdeveloped topic in existentialism and is a humanism barely touched on here, and also in our class for like necessity of time and reading and stuff. But authenticity is to act in good faith, to have a principle and to legislate actions freely, to exercise our will freely that legislates in virtue of those principles. This is what it is to act and be an authentic person, is to think what you do, right? Like to be the proof in the pudding, to walk the walk, these idioms, right? Do you have your hand up, Ashley?
Mhm. So in your example, what happens when, like, the leader is acting that way because that's their job? Like they're acting in good faith according to their job, but bad faith according to themselves.
Great. Yeah. So we should edit society so that there are not these social responsibilities, necessities that require people to act in bad faith. This is not a critique so much on Pierre from this perspective as it is a critique on the society that forces people with principles like Pierre to act contrary to that. Because, you know, say like Pierre loses his job, then his family starves to death, and that's that, right? No good. So the society that forces people to act in bad faith is itself already corrupt. And that was the argument, was that French and European society at the time was this either aristocratic or developing oligopolical capitalist society that was forcing the impoverished people of the time into acts like this. And especially with war too, you have a bunch of dissenters who are forced to fight, that kind of thing. The powers that be forcing bad faith at mass scale that causes the death of millions and generations, right? Another example Sartre gives of bad faith is the young lovers who are walking through the park at night, and like they like want to kiss, but they're too nervous, and so they don't. Then they just say like good night to one another. And this whole like barely touching the hand and like just not committing to your action, right? Not following through and being like a full blue-blooded doer of what you feel is right is a similar sort of form of bad faith. Did I see a hand over here? No? Okay. So that's good and bad faith. To act deliberately in ways that are contrary to your true principles or intentions. In Anguish, Abraham must decide if the voice of the angel is real and carries with it God's will. And I thought this was a really interesting sort of discussion from Sartre here that brings back the Kierkegaard reading that we did, right? That Abraham recognizes that he has a free choice. He can choose to not listen to the angel that says, "Hey, sacrifice your kiddo." He can choose to not do that, or he must choose to do it. And it's in the like being given the power right? Like the legislation of God is one thing, but I mean, Abraham was like the only person who did what God legislated. That's why we call them the Abrahamic religions, because all of his children became the Christians and Jews and Muslims, right? But Abraham had a choice, and it's in the weight of his responsibility, knowing that if he drops that knife into Isaac's chest, that he will be responsible for having chosen to do that, even if it was God's legislation. This is the anguish that follows radical freedom, right? The weight of the responsibility presses down upon you. And does this anguish lead us to an action? Well, no. The anguish we are concerned with here is not the kind that could lead to quietism or inaction. This is like the main objection coming to us from the communists, right? Is anguish pure and simple, of the kind experienced by all who have borne responsibilities. To the contrary, anguish is the very condition of their action, for they first contemplate several options and in choosing one of them, realize that its only value lies in the fact that it was chosen. It is not a screen that separates us from action, but a condition of action itself. That, think about it this way. Everything you do cuts off other possibilities, right? You choose not to come to class, but then you don't get the experience of having been here. You choose to order the burrito instead of the tacos, right? That you have, these are not very heavy weights, right? But they are weights, right? You have cut yourself off from alternate realities, from other possibilities. And it is up to you what you bring into the world, what you make of the world. Is your world a burrito world or a free street tacos world? And I hope it's the burrito world. So anguish is just the feeling that follows from, it's a condition of choosing, and we must choose in order to be. So abandonment, consequence 2. God does not exist, man is consequently abandoned, for he cannot find anything to rely on within or without. There are no excuses. We will encounter no values or orders that can legitimize our conduct. We are left alone and without excuse. That is what I mean when I say that man is condemned to be free, which is like the Sartre tagline. If Camus is one must imagine Sisyphus happy, or like have a cup of coffee for God's sake, then Sartre's is man is condemned to be free. Condemned because he did not create himself. We did not consent to the fact that we exist, and yet here we are. Yeah, nonetheless free because once cast into the world, he is responsible for everything he does. So God doesn't exist, nor does any essence preceding our existence beyond just mere social construct. What does this do for us? Well, in recognizing it, we realize that we are abandoned, that we are without recourse, that we must legislate for ourselves. And so here's where we get the student example that Jane mentioned to us at the outset. So one of Sartre's students is made to choose between joining the Free French forces or taking care of his mother. His country is under Nazi control. His father and brother are both dead. He's all that his mother has. So what should he do? He comes to Sartre, he's like, I just don't know what to do. Should he try to join the French forces and leave his mother to die of grief? So if he does so, will certainly die of grief. Or should he protect his future ideals and country at the cost of his family? He has conflicting intuitions. He has conflicting principles. How do I act in good faith? I don't know what to do. Should he stay at home with his mother to protect his family at the cost of willfully rebelling against the fascist Nazi control? So Sartre says he was vacillating between two kinds of morality. Morality motivated by sympathy and individual devotion, and another morality with a broader scope but less likely to be fruitful. He had to choose between the two. And no code of ethics or moral system of evaluation is able to make the right choice for the student. And he has to decide for himself. Any moral maxim will give vague advice to do good, but there's good in both options. So let's see. What should he do? Just for fun, what should the student do? Screw his mom.
Nah, stay with his mom.
Stay with his mom.
I'm not a mom person.
All right, join the army. Stay with mom. Stay with mom. Join the army.
Oscar the Army. Too.
Sex, drugs, and rock and roll.
Oh,
Everybody knows that. Yeah. Unsurprising from a class full of existentialism students. Well, great. So how about this? Another question then. How should he choose what to do? How do you decide?
I liked what Sartre said about the fact that he chose to come and discuss it with an existentialist philosopher. He didn't go to his bishop or priest or whoever. What he decided was affected by the fact that he chose to discuss it with Sartre.
Yeah, so why did you like that feature of the story? Like
Well,
what stood out as like the right move?
I liked that feature of the story because it said, well, I guess it said something to me about how I make decisions myself. That I guess it spoke to me that they aren't just, I guess, feelings of decisions and within myself. Just the fact that he decided to make his decision based on help from this person that obviously he respected, but that happened to be an existentialist philosopher. And so it says something about how we all make decisions. The fact that who we turn to in those decisions, whether it's just our own feelings or our own thoughts, or whether we turn to someone else, our spouse or our mother or whoever, that says something about who we are, doesn't it?
Yeah, cool. Yeah, it's really neat. So I like this impression. It gets me thinking. And there's two things. So one, like it reveals like the student's character, that he would choose the existentialist philosopher over other outlets. And I like this idea of like the decision of like, how do I choose and who do I go to for advice being revelatory of the character. Super cool. And then that gets me thinking, right? Is what does that reveal about the character? Like why the existentialist philosopher over other people? What sort of feature of character is it? And my thought is that the existentialist philosopher doesn't give an answer like the spouse or the priest or the parent or whatever. They give a very unique kind of answer. Whereas the spouse says, do what's best for our family. The parent says the same thing, but with a different meaning. The priest says, do what's best to like respect and love God, right? That to go to an existentialist philosopher is different because all of those other options are, here's a principle, act in accordance with it. And just like who you go to, you're gonna get a different principle. The existentialist philosopher says, express your freedom in the most free way possible. And what good does that do you, right? Well, it leads you to Sartre's conclusion, which is that at bottom, the best we have is feeling. You have intuition. You have like this thing in you that knows what it needs to do to legislate for itself, to express itself, right? And that it's the exercise of this like you-ness authentically that is forced by an abandoned choice. And so that what's revelatory of like the character of the student is that they're looking for inspiration to like be able to make that kind of anguished and abandoned choice rather than find solace in some other principle. At least that's my impression. I wonder if you agree with that, Jane, because that was just like my thought when you said that. I was excited by it.
Yeah, I do agree with it.
Cool. Yeah, so I had a few other hands who had, would you guys? Okay, 1, 2, did you have your hand up too, Rachel?
I don't know yet.
Okay, so let's do Will and then Ashley and then maybe Rachel.
Do you think the story is purposely structured like a utilitarian deontology thought experiment? Like the more utilitarian option would be like abandoning, sacrificing your mother to promote the general happiness of like your state and your countrymen.
Yeah, so Sartre does, it's sort of like he toy examples it a little bit and says, look, any abstract moral principle that you have is going to give you good reasons to do both. And so all of them kind of fail, which is true in pretty much all ethical dilemmas. You're not going to have a straight answer from anybody that purports to know what the good is. And Sartre says, look, in the absence of any like definitive answer, so like the utilitarian says, yeah, of course, you're like helping your country has sort of widespread value, but maybe you end up like at a desk or your boat sinks on the way and like nothing good happens and your mom dies, and that's like worse than any good you could have done universally. Or maybe like you miss out the chance on like adventure and saving the whole world. Like your bullet would have been the one that killed Hitler, kind of thing. You know, just you saved your mother instead, and you know what good is that if your bullet would have killed Hitler, kind of thing. And then the deontologist would say like, yeah, both are good, right? Both are sort of universalizable in the right sort of way. So yeah, the point is just that without, there is no like concrete moral system to guide action at the end of the day. Freedom is an expression of intuition, feeling at bottom, and it's really good when that feeling and intuition is authentic and consistent with one's principles done in good faith. Yeah, this feeling. Yeah, Ashley?
Yeah, I mean, I was originally just gonna say that, like, to answer your question from before, what do you do when you can't make a choice? And I realized that I tend to look deeper, but that's not on the surface, and it doesn't take, I mean, it takes a lot longer than, you know, normal to come up with that. And so I was gonna say that, like, subconscious is like tied to the body usually tells you. But then you said what you said about turning it into like you're abandoning the choice, and I thought that was really cool and insightful, and I agree with that. I think that kind of it ties into what I was gonna say about the body, because you don't really like identify much, but I really like that you tend to look for somebody else to tell you what you want them to tell you. Like it's like you know what it is,
It's already there.
but you can't know it until you know it's brought forth by something else.
Yeah. So recall the encountering relationship with oneself, which we'll develop more in a minute, where you encounter yourself, you were like in the world, right? And then all of a sudden your contemplative, reflective self's like, there it was, what's that like? How should I continue for it to be like anything at all? And that thing was already like living and doing and making its way just fine, right? So what Sartre is saying is, in order to make these choices, to get through the ethical dilemma, to exercise your freedom in good faith, is allow those selves that have encountered themselves to reunify, be that person that you are at bottom, and allow your feeling to guide your free expression of will.
Okay, sorry. This is like a little too topical for my life right now. And I'm facing, not yet, but I've been like impending facing a decision very similar. And do you think there's like a trade-off? So even if you're going for like one kind of axiomatic thing, no matter what choice you make, if you're doing it at the cost of the other one, does that also inform your essence because you've still made like a sacrifice that might be against your other like value?
Yeah, so like conflicting values, right?
Yeah.
And that's what this is supposed to express. This is like the ethical dilemma made existentialist, when you don't know what it is to act in good faith, and either possibility potentially affords inauthenticity. Sartre advises that the only way through that thicket is to just do it, feel it, right? Whatever the feeling is at heart, that like the thing, you flip a coin, right? And then you catch it and you know what you want it to be, kind of thing. I think that's kind of the feeling that he's talking about here. That's at least my interpretation. And so the ethical dilemma isn't resolved by a matter of like contemplative reflection after like reason has gone through all the pros and cons of everything and still hasn't reached its conclusion. And yet like forced to act, abandoned of principle, and in anguish of the like knowing the consequences of the responsibility that comes from making such a choice. We do so anyways, because this is not a philosophy in actions, etc. So I don't know if that's like therapeutically helpful, but I think that's like at least the structure of Sartre's answer to that is just like you feel the right thing to do.
I mean, I think the other part of what I'm asking is like, so if he goes to war, some might consider him like a bad son. And so does that then kind of like inscribe onto his essence because that was the choice he made?
Yeah, and that's despair. That's the third consequence. Yeah, so either he's a bad son or he's a bad Frenchman or countryman or brother or whatever. So there's no winning, and thus, in addition to anguish and abandonment, we also have despair.
Oh yeah, good.
That was great comedic timing.
Good. Okay.
Choose to act in bad faith and just tell her that it won't change who she is right now.
Yeah, it'll all be fine. Okay. So despair. Man is nothing other than his own project, says Sartre. He exists only to the extent that he realizes himself. Therefore, he is nothing more than the sum of his actions, nothing more than his life. But all life and choice is a matter of probability. For all of our best intentions, we can fail. And sometimes there's just no like good choice, right? There's like, it's the Sophie's choice. Do you kill twin A or twin B? And they're both impossible and neither is good. And you're messed up if you do either, but you must do one. So you're like even worse off if you don't choose opposite. Despair. In life, man commits himself and draws his own portrait, outside of which there is nothing. We don't always get to control the paint that we're given or the canvas upon which that portrait is to be writ. So in light of all of this, what people reproach us for, the existentialists, is not essentially our pessimism, but the sternness of our optimism, that we must remain optimistic in spite of the despair, that to make a choice to stay with the mother is to be a bad countryman, to make the choice to go to war is to be a bad son, and that is writ upon who we make ourselves out to be, for better and for worse. And so we are sternly optimistic in that we affirm our choices and the consequences through the radical universal responsibility under which our free will is predicated. So the abandonment felt in anguish certainly leads to despair, but there's always action. There's always continued painting. And importantly, there's always the ability to do work authentically in good faith. For this existentialist, this is enough. And so here's our objection slide, right? So this is Sartre's response to the communists. This is how he responds to the quietism, despair, inaction stuff. So now Sartre is going to move on to the sort of more everyday accusations. And I don't know if this is deliberate. I think it probably is. Sartre's pretty smart. His lecture mirrors Plato's Apology, where Socrates deals with the formal charges and then the informal charges, right? So he might just be being a little clever here, yeah. You don't get to be like public intellectual without a bit of drama. Anyways, existentialist subjectivity. So this is the existentialism is a humanism bit. Where do we get the humanism? As our point of departure, there can be no other truth than this. I think, therefore I am. This is the absolute truth of consciousness confronting itself. Any theory that considers man outside of this moment of self-awareness is at the outset a theory that suppresses the truth. For outside of this Cartesian cogito, all objects are merely probably, and a doctrine of probabilities is not rooted in any truth, crumbles into nothing. In order to define the probable, one must define what is true. Therefore, in order for any truth to exist, there must first be an absolute truth. Okay, so the absolute truth and subjectivity is only a starting point. And the subjective here isn't like the I feel thing. It's the truth is first derived internally. So there's this like absoluteness to subjectivity, which is that what we have going on in our lives, right? The like reflection thing where you encounter yourself, all of that happens internally first. The meaning making is done internally and then sort of expressed outwards in its legislative capacity. And in contrast to Descartes, the existentialists affirm that the I think is inspired by direct contact with the other. So this is a really interesting point, and it's also one that de Beauvoir will develop quite a bit, which is maybe the most complicated and most interesting part of the ethic of ambiguity, is this encountering relationship. But what, as Sartre discusses it here, says, look, the I think for Descartes is part of a meditation, right? It's Descartes looking at a candle next to a burning fireplace and seeing it melt and being like, oh God, whoa, here I am, right? That Descartes' cogito, the I think therefore I am, is something that is done sans the world. Everything else disappears. It's an a priori in the head, requires no empirical experience realization. And it's important for Descartes that it operates that way for like his whole proof for God's existence and like the justification for doing material mechanical science. But it also has massive metaphysical, moral implications as well. When your whole premise for existence is something that first comes from within and then looks without. For the existentialists, it's the opposite. It's not that like I just delete away the whole world through the process of doubt, find only myself, and then I get the rest of the world from that. It's the other way around, is that I recognize myself only in virtue of being a part of the world. It's completely a posteriori, it's completely empirical, and it's not by encountering the world, so to speak. It's by encountering another person. It's that we get this recognition of self. We encounter ourselves only after encountering someone else that resembles us, right? That is like us, the other person. The two people together encounter themselves by encountering each other. So when I cannot discover any truth whatsoever about myself except through the mediation of another. The other is essential to my existence, as well as to the knowledge that I have of myself. Under these conditions, my intimate discovery of myself is at the same time a revelation of the other as a freedom that confronts my own, and that cannot think or will without doing so for or against me. We are thus immediately thrust into the world we may call intersubjectivity. It is in this world that man decides what he is and what others are. I think this is a really, really cool thought, that when we are meaning making for ourselves, we're doing so in virtue of recognizing other people meaning making for themselves. At the same time, we recognize that my meaning making has an effect on you and yours on me. And it only matters at all insofar as we're like in this world and in this relationship together. And so there's this quality of intersubjectivity where our subjective self-encounterings are dependent upon each other's, right? That your encountering yourself depends upon my encountering myself. And the content of that perceptual experience of that encountering is the recognition of one's own freedom and the freedom of the other, right? And from this intersubjective condition, we're going to have a whole bunch of setup of like, here's how to treat that intersubjective recognition with respect and like dignity and make it work well together, which again is underdeveloped here, but way developed in the ethics of ambiguity. Okay. Boop. What time is it? 6:20. Let's talk about this and then we'll take a quick break. So what do you think about this experience of self-encountering via the experience of another? Do we see like the authentic person in front of us, or do we see them merely as like a resemblance of self, right? Is like when I see someone else, do I see them only as sort of like a manifestation of my own mind, right? They're like, oh, you look kind of like me. Or is it that like there is like this truly, I see an other, right? It's something not self, that is itself dignified and full of its own freedom. A freedom is what Sartre calls the realization. Yeah, right?
I just had a question. Is this kind of this idea where that is a quote of hell is other people? Is that this kind of where it comes from?
Hell is other people comes from the play No Exit, which is also, I think it's in season 1 of the Twilight Zone. You guys know the Twilight Zone? And if you don't, you should. The Twilight Zone does their own version of No Exit. But the idea of the play, it's excellent. It's really fun. Is like one guy gets led into this empty room by a butler who he recognizes to be like some kind of demon. And he's like, okay, this is my punishment. I'm in hell. I'm just like doomed to be alone forever. And then I don't know, a few hours later, the butler brings in this woman that he was in love with, but that like hated him. And then she's like, oh no, I have to spend eternity with this asshole. And he is just like yearning for her. And then the butler brings in somebody else that like she loved, but that like doesn't love her back, but loves this guy, but the guy didn't love her. So it's like this lover's triangle. And then they add a fourth person, and you know, there's a whole bunch of like unrequited love and people being mad at each other because they can't give each other what they need or want. And everybody's deprived completely. And then at the end, it's like hell is other people, right? The hell is not like fire and brimstone. It's having to suffer with you people. But similar, yeah. So the idea is that all of their like feelings and hatred for one another is like done in bad faith. And so they make their own hell by being in bad faith with the people that they yearn for and love but cannot have because the feeling is not reciprocal, right? So the hell is other people is like we made the world shit ourselves because we aren't able to treat each other with the sort of compassion and respect that we ourselves want and deserve. Yeah, so that's helpful. Good. Jason.
Yeah, I think this is interesting and there's something to it, but when he frames it in these like Cartesian terms, I just don't think it holds at all, because the point of the cogito is that like it withstands the evil demon doubt.
Yeah.
And it's like very direct. Like you can, Descartes can't think of a way to doubt that. But when I encounter other people, it's purely through sense experience, and it's like very easy to doubt that. I could very easily be wrong about who you are, and I probably am wrong about who you are, it seems to me, because it's so much less direct than the way I encounter myself. So if he hadn't framed it in like Cartesian terms, I'd probably be a lot more open to it. But like this, I'm not really into it.
Yeah, so let's drill deeper then. When we encounter each other, we like recognize our own freedom and dignity. We're like, oh, I'm a person. So the Cartesian thing, you could be wrong about how I express that freedom, but do you also think that you could be wrong about the fact that I have freedom, that I am a person, right? That is free?
Yeah, I mean, like I could be dreaming that maybe you're not a person at all.
Yeah.
Or maybe you're just a robot that looks like a person and acts like a person, but you have no inner experience at all. There's no way for me to distinguish those things.
Have I been that obvious? Yeah, good. So I could be, but is that like your general experience when you're encountering other people?
No.
Yeah.
But it's significant, I think, at least when you're framing it in Cartesian terms, that I can't distinguish the two.
Right. So there's almost an equivocation of terms, right? That the project of Descartes was to find indubitability, to find some like established truth that from which like as a first principle, he could make science like cool with the church, basically. But here the project is not indubitability, but like intersubjective social networking in a harmonious kind of way. And so the equivocation would be to say like, look, you've bootstrapped in these terms, this way of thinking that just does not apply to the intersubjective social sphere because it's all contingent, right? It's not indubitable at all. Yeah, so I think, again, the charitability to default thing, the way that I read this, because that is a real concern here for sure, is to read the Cartesian language as like an analogy, or like maybe even as metaphor, rather than as like parallel project, where the meaning that is shared, the like metaphorical evocation is just that there's the like fundamental truth, the important part of the system, the core battery that charges and gives power to everything else is the subjective and personal quality of like recognition. One becomes aware of the cogito, and then all of a sudden in 6 meditations you've proven God, and Galileo was right. Or you encounter someone else and all of a sudden realize that you're abandoned, anguished, and despaired, right? And it's something about you that is recognized. So that I think is, but I also agree that you're right, that the difference in the projects strikes of a kind of equivocation.
Yeah, and there's a few quotes where he like almost explicitly, or maybe there's one where he almost explicitly says that he is kind of like his epistemological system is Cartesian. And then like in the part early with Abraham, when he's asked like how could Abraham know, he's like doing a very Cartesian doubt thing, and he seems to take the doubt very seriously in that case. And I think you're right that in this case it's not the point for him, so maybe he's just
You're right, and that it's a little damning that he uses that form of reasoning earlier on too. So what I take the objection to be then is that what Descartes gives good enough argument for, like whether or not we agree with it, the cogito is an indubitable first principle, right? The form of intersubjective recognition and encountering is not anything like that in terms of indubitability, and there might be all sorts of weird, messy gray space in between, and yet Sartre presents the intersubjective encountering as a kind of just like natural law of interaction. Yeah,
because I think I agree that it is a useful thing to think about, and I probably have experienced something like this. I just don't think it's like some first principle like foundation, but yeah, it's an interesting and like very important point.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, I like that objection. It's good. Ashley, you had your hand up, and then Shane.
I agree with all of that. I was just gonna bring up the like for someone experienced psychopathy, that like they actually don't see other people as other people. So it's like becomes like, okay, so does Descartes think that they aren't people then? Like, you know, sort of a thing. Like, what is a man? You know, also like the brain in the vat. What is the sect of, or the section of philosophy that handles that stuff?
Philosophy of mind.
Philosophy of mind. I feel like it just turns into that thing. Like, it's, yeah, but you guys kind of closed it off anyway, like, and just said, you know, like there's a lot of gray area.
Yeah. So what Sartre presents again is like natural law in the form of interaction is probably not so clearly always the case. There are all sorts of weird counterexamples like you would see in philosophy of mind when trying to explain what meaning making is for like concepts. Good, yeah. But it is important for existentialism with respect to its evocative power that this is the case. Yeah, good.
Can I interject something?
Sure, is that okay, Ashley? Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I can't see anyone, so I mean, I can just see the your notes. So if you look at an infant, everything that they see or feel is based on their interaction with another human being. And in fact, if they don't get interaction with another human being, a lot of times they just die. So I would have to say that who we are is so much based on our interactions with another human, especially how we end up becoming who we are.
Yeah, I think this is another really cool point. Sartre, at least from this perspective, I would be really curious to know what he thought about development. So from the perspective of this lecture, it's like Sartre is talking about already like fully adult completed people who are like all of a sudden like, oh God, I'm free, I'm a person, right? So are you, right? But there's a whole lot of like developmental features of, you're right, like interaction and mirror neurons and babies growing brains and figuring out what's good and bad and what works and what doesn't, right? That doesn't seem to also rely upon the baby recognizing their mother as a freedom, right? That seems a little complex for a toddler. But I just don't know what Sartre would say about developmental social recognition. And maybe he would say, look, none of that stuff matters. Not because it's unimportant or uninteresting, but that we can already do everything that we want with social activism and like political life from the perspective of like adults interacting with one another. I could see him doing it. It's like a pretty typical philosopher, like Aristotle, right? Says, look, you only like count if you're older than 14 and you grew up in a society that trained you how to do politics well. So it's not outside the realm of possibility that that kind of consideration would get written off. But I think it's really interesting to think about is, are there even like overlaps in the kind of encountering that Sartre is talking about and the form of like recognition and growth and educational development that toddlers and babies experience? I think that would be a really cool project. So yeah, thanks for sharing. Cool. Shane?
I had two things to say. One of them was a lot like that. Experience expectant plasticity is what it's called. Like you don't grow like retinal ganglion cells if you don't see when you're a baby. And in the same way, you don't develop language if nobody talks to you. Like, ever heard like tragic story of Jeannie? I don't know what her real last name.
Yeah, like
is.
the wild girl.
Yeah.
What did they call her?
Feral.
Feral.
The feral girl. Yeah, she was like chained to a bed her whole life because her.
So she was 12, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And like she never could do a lot of things that were based on language. That was the first thing. The second thing I was going to say is regarding the like, is he real? Are you like, is this a good analogy to Descartes? I think Sartre would say it doesn't matter if he's real, because in the same way that it doesn't matter if God's real. That's probably what he would say. If you're encountering this person, you're still getting feedback from this person. You're still developing an identity through interactions with other people. That's kind of how I took it when I read it. I was like, oh, it's like developing identity.
So another cool like project idea then is does the encountering relationship that inspires respect for others' freedom and the recognition of one's own meaning making require humanity, or like would it like a Turing test sufficient AI do just well enough? That could be kind of fun, especially with all the Dolly stuff going on. Yeah, super cool. And then yeah, this talk of the feral girl. Yeah, she was like chained to a bed in a dark room and like given food for 12 years, and that's it. Never learned language. And so there's this, like, she got discovered, and her parents obviously would go to jail, and so she's taken into protective custody. And this linguist woman, I think it was a woman, works with her for a couple of years, and almost got her to speak language, and then like lost funding, and there was some kind of tragedy, and then she just like couldn't do it and got past the critical point where like it was possible to learn a language, and so they institutionalized her. Is the story. It's a huge tragedy, super interesting. It's like really popular in developmental psychology and in like linguistics, especially with respect to like Chomsky linguistics, like how language is developed and how we learn to attach meaning to linguistic constructs and stuff. Really worth like probably more than a Wikipedia dive too. Just like there's all sorts of cool documentaries. But what the like neurodivergence case or like human animal gray area bounded into human being as like a person as we socially recognize them is really interesting, because again, like Sartre is coming from this not just perspective what he calls like stern optimism, but like we're all completely responsible for what we do, and it's like radical freedom and stuff. These are not like kid concepts. These are very much Western adult moral ideas, right? They come from this is how you take things seriously kind of attitude. And that attitude, I don't think is available to everybody. And in advanced cases like babies or the like non-socialized human, certainly not. And then in cases of like neurodivergent psychopathy or whatever, that you get a kind of contrast. So I know, Ryan, you brought this up on the discussion board. I don't want to like put you on the spot, but like, did you have thoughts in bringing that up? If you'd like
Yeah,
to
I
share.
mean, I was, because the first thing I thought of was like the insanity plea in like a criminal trial, and Sartre talks about responsibility a lot and how our choices are our responsibility to all that. But the insanity plea, of course, goes along the lines of, well, this person doesn't have the competency to know what is right or wrong, and so therefore some of the responsibility is taken off of this person. And so I don't know, it just seems like with cases like that, with cases of insanity or cases of, I don't know, some kind of abnormal brain issues, then this whole responsibility thing kind of seems to fall apart a little bit to me.
Yeah. Rachel, do you want to follow up to that?
So this reminds me of like the myth of Narcissus,
Mhm.
where I think like, especially like the modern connotation around narcissism, like, he's like transfixed, or like the reflecting pool acts as like a narcotic on him. And then that like fairy comes around and she's like, let's fool around, this is the thing. And he's like, no, I'm really chilling here.
I'm busy.
Yeah. But like, it seems like the connotation, at least as we take it, is that has stifled his development, is because he didn't have that intersubjectivity, because he was so fixated with just the self that he couldn't even define himself in opposition or same with other people. But then I'm also inclined to be like, we can never really have full, like the original question you asked, that we can never really have full intersubjectivity, because we can never, like, I can't see you because I haven't seen your experiences. But at the same time, through experiential knowledge, I'm like, if one was theoretically to take hallucinogenic drugs with someone else, like, it's a very different experience and you almost do see each other. You know what I mean? So I wonder how much of that is mediated by, like, it almost seems like it's like antecedent to prior things that had come before that are deterministic of then how that intersection or intersubjectivity functions, if it does.
Yeah. Yeah, the quality of recognition is probably has a lot to do with how you learn to like do it in the first place. what you see in others depends on what you're aware of, right? What you're looking for, what is visible to you, and whether or not you're able to do it at all, to like, regardless of content of freedom and expression of meaning and resemblance of other with self in this respect, depends on a capacity to encounter in the appropriate kind of way at all. Yeah, so perspective shifts what's seen, and perspective at all is contingent, right? Yeah, all of this is really good. This is objection to Sartre, like saying, look, this isn't universal. It doesn't work for everybody, and the way it works for everybody is not consistent enough to make the project come together. Good. Yeah, Shane.
I'm gonna take this like less charitably, I guess. I feel like we've been talking about the intersubjectivity on like a surface level. And I feel like Sartre, especially later with his comments with Pierre or whoever the critic was in the Q&A,
Neville.
yeah, talks about Sartre's beliefs in the intersubjectivity, where Sartre starts talking about like basically there's no cause and effect, which kind of like destroys science. I read this as like there's almost like no objective reality, and so like objective reality doesn't exist. We all have like our own realities, and then our realities meet other people's realities, and that's how we realize that like we have a reality. And then if it's taken that far, it seems, at least to me, to be a bit like how do I say this charitably, not out there.
Yeah, and that is exactly the project, right? That's what Sartre's trying to say.
Okay.
And then it's like, look, I have like a subjective thing that I recognize as subjective because all of a sudden there's another subjective bubble outside of mine,
Yeah.
right? The boundaries of me are limited by the boundaries of everybody around me, right? Otherwise I would just be unlimited, right? Reaching out into infinite empty space, but I hit walls, and those walls are other people's subjective experiences. But as it turns out, we're also able to recognize all these overlaps in subjective experiences, and then we have our intersubjective reality. And it's that sort of thing that we need to pay respect to when acting in good faith and like interacting with others. And the way that we do that in the best sort of way possible is to maximize freedom and to like have a will to be free sort of thing. But yeah, that begins to start to look kind of out there.
So he doesn't just talk about this almost like metaphysically or morally. He's talking about it like truly physically. There is no.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, exactly. So maybe no. Let's take a break. Let's take what time is it? Let's take 5 minutes. Come back at 6:50, and then we'll finish up. Let's return. So we just talked about existentialist subjectivity. Here's the intersubjective quality of existentialism as Sartre describes it. So although it is impossible to find in every man a universal essence that can be said to comprise a human nature, a soul, or the image of God through which man is created, or like the human dignity thing, there is nonetheless a universal human condition. Man's fundamental situation in the universe, in this sense, human universality exists, but is not a given. It is in perpetual construction. In choosing myself, I construct universality. I construct it by understanding every other man's project, regardless of the era in which he lives. The fundamental aim of existentialism is to reveal the link between the absolute character of the free commitment by which every man realizes himself in realizing a type of humanity, and the relativity of the cultural ensemble that may result from such a choice. So what Sartre is saying in this quote is like, look, our relationship with the world is our own, and we, insofar as we're radically free and responsible, we legislate that reality for everybody else. And it is the goal of existentialism to sort of map out how these legislations happen, how they occur, where they intersect, and how they can operate together. So is existentialism inhuman in this sense? Is it too solipsistic? Is it alone? Well, existentialists who commit to radical freedom may be unlike people like the normal people who criticize them of inhumanity, in that they aspire to act in complete good faith, but are they truly strangers? Sartre argues that, well, no, we're not inhuman, that existentialism is a kind of humanism because we're interested in this intersubjective understanding of reality as such, that we're all working together to create it. And all we do is recognize that each of us has a part to play in that, and that we're responsible for the part that we do play, which makes them look a little strange. So man is his own project and always becoming. There is no a priori way to decide how to act. Man makes himself. He does not come into the world fully made. He makes himself by choosing his own morality, and his circumstances are such that he has no option other than to choose a morality. We can define man only in relation to his commitments. And if our commitments are actualized by our freely willing them, then freedom lies at the heart of acting authentically. And as Sartre says, progress implies improvement, but man is always the same, confronting a situation, this universal condition, right, that is forever changing, while choice always remains a choice in any situation, which is just to say that the world is full of twists and turns. But what remains the same is how we choose to lean into or against those curves, and that is a choice which is up to us. Freedom is at the heart of the project of being yourself, to live authentically. You act freely. You don't act constrained under some principle, some essence which precedes you. You act for the sake of your own principles. You legislate for yourself and for the world, and hopefully we make that work together. So when I affirm that freedom under any circumstance can have no other aim than itself, so like insofar as I ought to act in a way that like wills freedom, in this state of abandonment, that it is he who imposes values, he who can will but one thing, freedom is the foundation of all values. So Sartre is telling us that there is one thing that should be our principle, such that everybody can intersubjectively act in good faith, which is that freedom is the foundation of all value. If we're going to legislate any value, the first value we should legislate is freedom universally. So act always such that the maximum of your action universalizes freedom in all men, would be something like the Kantian form of Sartre's categorical imperative. So in order to be free, everyone around me must be free as well. The more freedom, the ability to express, the ability to have capacity and permissibility to do, the more we will socially have that capacity shared with each other.
Why freedom instead of what the opposite of suffering would be?
Yeah, like happiness or
Okay.
satisfaction, flourishing. Because the existentialists don't care about feeling good.
Well,
They care
I
about
care
living
about feeling good
authentically,
either,
even
but
if it makes them stern and despairing.
more so the absence of suffering. Like, I don't know how to say it other than that.
Yeah.
but
The existentialist is also, insofar as freedom and lack thereof is not a form of suffering, right? Like if suffering is just the privation of freedom, then great. But if suffering means something else, freedom can be maximized and it involves a bit of suffering, then the existentialist is going to be cool with that. Yeah. Okay. So my ability to choose depends on living without constraints, right? To not be coerced, to not be limited. And if we all have a society of constraints, then we're all held back, right? We're constraining each other. We're less free. So my freedom depends on your freedom. If you're unconstrained, then you won't constrain me. And together, by willing for the sake of freedom, we work together to uninhibit ourselves from the latent social constraints holding us back, right? Smash the tablets, destroy the patriarchy, get rid of the aristocracy, monopolies are bad, this kind of thing, right? Where people are put under constraint, they're able to act less free, and so they're not able to will the one thing that is the foundation upon all values that are done authentically in good faith. So if you choose to act in bad faith, which is a kind of philosophical suicide, right? You make your particular choice freely, but you constrain freedom generally. So I'm obliged to will the freedom of others at the same time as I will my own. I cannot set my own freedom as a goal without also setting the freedom of others as a goal. Consequently, when operating on the level of complete authenticity. I've acknowledged that existence precedes essence, and that man is a free being who under any circumstances can only ever will his freedom. I have at the same time acknowledged the freedom of others. And here's an example of acting freely in bad faith. I want to thank every Amazon employee and every Amazon customer because you guys paid for all this. Seriously, for every Amazon customer out there and every Amazon employee, thank you from the very bottom of my heart very much. It was very appreciated as he sends himself into space.
You actually say that?
That is a quote word for word
Yeah.
from Jeff Bezos' supervillain.
Have you heard his laugh? He literally laughs like a supervillain. He actually goes.
Oh my God. Yeah, I had no idea. I will look that up after class.
I like the Elon Musk picture.
Yeah, so I made these slides last year, right after this happened. And I added that picture today because I thought it was great. Yeah, his physique looks like deep breath here. So in the words of David Lynch, the immortal and amazing David Lynch, what a great time to be alive if you love the theater of the absurd, and is nothing more absurd than this. Literally, this is what Sartre is telling us to do, is Jeff Bezos, in saying this quote, has recognized and is thanking everybody for giving or being constrained, right? Being like sacrificing their freedom for the sake of his ability to go to space, right? To get in his giant phallic space missile and send himself to the moon, right? That comes at the cost of the constraint of billions of people around the world, right? This is exactly what Sartre is like, do not let this happen. We need to like socially work together to recognize and respect the freedom of each other, to love one another, and to will the freedom of one another for the sake of one another, so that giant phallic missile man can't send himself to space, right? And then to say like, thank you for doing that, right? It's not good. Because here we are all poor and still here, and isn't it a shame that he came back? I mean, but seriously, it is so absurd to me that this happens, that some dude can like make the world his own, to exercise freedom so greatly and so powerfully at the cost of everybody else. This is to will one's own freedom without willing everybody else's in the extreme. And what are we left with? Amazon Prime Day, where everything stays the same price. So did you have an end up?
Oh, just why did he bring William Shatner? I still haven't understood that.
I would too.
I mean, I'm not against William
Fair enough.
Shatner, but and then at the end when they land and he like sprays him with champagne, like it was just, this was absurd.
Wait. Who sprayed who with champagne?
Bezos, like they landed and William Shatner's like Jay chilling and he's like trying to like be like, wow, this was so profound, like little blue dot deal.
Right.
And Bezos just like shakes champagne, it goes in his face. And I was just like, then why did you bring William Shatner? Like it feels like an episode of BoJack Horseman. I'm like, what is happening?
Theater of the absurd.
That is the exact opposite of which I was expecting. I was expecting, when you said that, I was like, oh, William Shatner sprayed Jeff Bezos with champagne? That doesn't make sense.
No, watch the
Oh, it's
watch the
so
video
weird.
after, you're gonna cringe a lot.
Ashley?
Would you argue that it's even more absurd that there are so many defenders of Bezos, like in the working class?
Not during class. During class, I will argue that this is an exact representation of willing one's freedom at the cost of other people's, and how absurd and messed up the consequences of that end up being. So existentialism is a humanism, to wrap up. Humanism is not meant to be understood in its original theistic way. There's some like soul quality in people, and that's what we have to respect and love and whatever. Rather, it's not this enlightenment idea. It's that the existentialist does away with this kind of valuation. There's no essence that precedes our existence. Instead, existentialism leaves in its place the importance of understanding life as a project of art. And each of us is the artificer or artist of our own work, our own meaning making. And again, there are better and worse ways to do it. To, in good faith, will freedom for the sake of all, including ourselves. In bad faith, to send ourselves to space. So humanism for the existentialist just means that we're all human. We're this intersubjective, right? And by recognizing in despair and anguish and our collective abandonment, we are given reason to act, and hopefully for the sake of one another. And in action, to will authentically is to will for the sake of all beings' freedom. And in this sense, existentialism is optimistic, though perhaps stern, because it might involve some suffering. It is a doctrine of action that makes living well together in our universally shared condition authentically possible. And that is the end. So next week, we will read the first half of the Ethics of Ambiguity. And like I mentioned at the beginning of class, I'd like to pre-apologize for how painful and challenging it will be. But I promise it's really good. And hopefully we'll have learned some strategies from like the challenging reading so far that it won't be so bad, because it is really good. And it like the myth of Sisyphus, existentialism as a humanism, and the ethics of ambiguity are like the big three, right? And the ethics of ambiguity is like the development of those other two, and really an excellent development of them. So it's a nice place to like have as a crowning achievement for our work in the class, which you guys have done an excellent job of. I've been really proud of all of you and humbled myself by your excellent insights so far. We have 2 more weeks of class, and then that'll be it. Yeah, so let me pause the